This is our outline of the book of 2 Corinthians. This is Paul's defense of his apostleship and his ministry. We see more of that defense. He calls it boasting in chapter 11. And that may be a misunderstanding if we take the term boasting as in the sense of arrogant bragging. If you walked away from a class or a sermon that you heard someone preach, and your report was, well, all he was doing was boasting, the impression would be kind of arrogant and bragging about himself. That's not what Paul did. He defends himself and his apostleship, and that's what he's doing in the book, but particularly chapters 10 and 11. So we're ready for chapter 10 through 13, where Paul answers his critic. He explains his ministry. He talks about the collection for the poor saints, 8 and 9. And now chapters 10 to 13 deals with his answering of his critics. And we talked last time about Paul's power, his apostolic power. That's what chapter 10 is about. And so let's look at his apostolic power. There are three things that are developed in chapter 10. And verses 1 to 6, Paul talks about my authority to use spiritual weapons. We're going to hit that briefly. We talked somewhat about that. Chapter 10, 7 through 11 is my authority is from God and it will be used. And then 12 to 18, my authority does not cause me to boast. Not in the sense that others are boasting, but he does boast when we get to chapter 11. And we'll talk about the sense of that here in just a moment. So we're going to hit this rather quickly, get a summary. Let's try to piece all of this together. In chapter 10, verses 1 through 6, his authority is to use spiritual weapons. He has an authority as an apostle, and it's for using spiritual weapons. He said that he would plead with them by the meekness and the gentleness of Christ. And the reason he mentions that, obviously, is of some of the criticism that is being offered concerning him. Some of the criticism is that he's timid when he is present, but he's bold when he's away. Boy, when he's in your presence, he seems like this timid, mild, meek guy, but he sure is bold when he fires the letters off. And that was one of the criticisms being made. Another criticism was that he walks according to the flesh, that he was not a true apostle, that his letters are weighty, but his presence is weak. They ridiculed his very appearance. When we get to chapter 11, there's even more that we'll mention, but those are some of the things mentioned in chapter 10. Now, beginning at verse 3 now. Let's go on to verse 3. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. As we mentioned last time, he's not talking about that we live life in the flesh. He is talking about that. We live life in the flesh, but we don't war according to the flesh. The idea of flesh, I think, is apart from divine influence. That the war that we're after and the war that we're fighting and the battle that we're in and the authority I use is not after man and his power, aside and apart from and divorced from divine influence. Now at verse 4, 5, and 6, his point is that our war and the weapons that I use are not carnal. Now, notice at verse 4, but the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God for the pulling down of strongholds. In other words, we're after fighting strongholds. And we partly defined stronghold last time. Has to do with a fortress. Thayer says it includes arguments. In other words, the false teachers that had infiltrated the church at Corinth were making arguments, and they come up as a fortress where, in other words, it's as if we're fighting a literal battle, but we're not, but it's not carnal. We're fighting against the strongholds. We're trying to tear down the strongholds. So every argument they make, every position they put up, that Paul is not an apostle, which is in effort to say that his teaching is false, we try to tear that down. The second thing he mentions is not only strongholds, but the weapons of our warfare are not carnal for pulling down the strongholds and casting down the imaginations, King James says. American Standard says the same thing, or the arguments. In other words, their reasoning. Well, obvious that Paul did that kind of thing is from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He takes their argument and reasons through that and shows if your reasoning is true, it leads to a consequence you're not willing to accept. And so he works through their reasoning and dismantles their reasoning. He said, that's the kind of thing I'm doing. And then he mentions a third thing he fights against is every high thing that exalts itself against Christ or against God, against the knowledge of God, and bringing every thought into captivity. In other words, every high thing would be a barrier, or one lexicographer would mention a bulwark. In other words, a stronghold, a fortress again. And so we're trying to tear down everything that's put up to defend. We're working through that. So here's his point in verses 1 to 6, that we are in a spiritual battle, and the battle is for the souls of men. Does that make sense? We're battling for the souls of men. And so we are in not a carnal battle. I'm not fighting with carnal warfare. I'm not fighting like these false teachers are fighting. Now, what are some of the carnal things? Well, some of the carnal things they're using are personal tactics. We talked a little about that last time. They make personal attacks against Paul. They ridicule his appearance. They say that he's two-faced, and that he's bold one time, but then he's not another time. But you just think, for example, of this matter of ridiculing his appearance. Does that mean that that what he says is not true? No, it doesn't mean that at all. And yet that's a carnal tactic. And so he says our warfare is not carnal. I don't use the same kind of tactics that my enemies use, that these false teachers are using. We're in a battle for the souls of men. We're in a spiritual warfare. Now, I know that's hurried, but we covered some part of that last time. Verses 7 through 11. His point here is that my authority is from God, and I will use that authority. Now, let's go back and establish this. Why is his authority under attack? And let me preface your answer by saying this. I don't think his enemies are out against Paul because they don't like Paul. They're not against Paul because if they can discredit him as an apostle, but they love the other apostles and they love the truth, but they're trying to discredit his apostleship because
one thing I see this week in 11 is where he didn't take money. It's almost like that he's not an apostle because we wouldn't pay him, so he don't have credibility.
Yeah, he doesn't have credibility. So they're trying to discredit his credibility because he's what? All right, he wasn't originally an apostle. They didn't agree. Bingo, that's what we're after. They didn't agree with his message. It's not Paul they're after. They're after what he accomplishes. Quite often that's the case. When you hear criticism being made of maybe it's a godly person and their character is being destroyed, and you know they're godly, it's probably not the person they're after. It's what they stand for. Does that make sense? They're trying to tear that down, and that's what they're after with Paul. They don't care about Paul. If Paul died, they still hate the doctrine, and so they're after the doctrine. All right, so 7 through 11, he talks about his authority is from God. Let's look at 7 and 8. We raised a question last time. Was this a question or is this a statement? Punctuation is supplied by translators. So you may be looking at a translation that words it as a statement. Others word it as a question. Which is it? Well, it may be a question or it may be a statement. I'm not sure. I want to think it's more of a statement than a question. Do you look at things according to the outward appearance? The New International mentions it as a statement. You are looking on the surface of things. In other words, if you're listening to these false teachers and my critics, you're looking at the surface of things. And so he appeals to them to take a closer look. So what does he have them to look at? Verse 7. You consider yourself a servant of Christ. And his point at verse 8 is, so do I. Make sense? So do I. If anyone is convinced he himself is Christ, let him consider this in himself, that just as he is Christ, even so we're Christ. That's all I'm doing as an apostle, as being a servant of Christ. You Corinthians, consider yourself servants of Christ. And he said, I too am a servant of Christ. Now, verse 8, for even if I boast somewhat about our authority, which the Lord gave us for edification and not for your destruction, I shall not be ashamed. So here's his point in 7 and 8. Just like you claim to be a servant of Christ, I am a servant of Christ. I'm an apostle of Christ, and I intend to use that authority, not for your destruction. I think that's an implication of what the false teachers are doing. But I'm using that authority for your edification. And what's the phrase mean at the end of verse 8? And I shall not be ashamed. I'm going to continue to do what I'm doing. Not going to change. I'm not ashamed. His authority comes from Christ. I'm not going to apologize for that. In other words, a man might teach the truth. It might be a Bible class teacher. It might be a preacher. It might be someone else. And they teach some truth, and it's questioned, and he comes back and says, I'm going to continue to teach the truth, and I'm not apologizing for it. I'm not apologizing for using this authority. I was given the authority as an apostle. I'm going to use it. And I don't apologize for that. Now let's begin at verse 9. He says, I will exercise this authority when I'm present. So I want to quickly hit this because we want to move on to something else. He's been accused, verses 9 and 10, of being bold in his letters. Why would they say he's bold in his letters? The way they come across? Just a cursory reading of 1 Corinthians would tell you that, wouldn't it? They're kind of strong, kind of pointed, kind of powerful. And they said he's strong and bold in his letters, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. Was Paul, in his physical appearance, kind of a less than desirable figure? Probably so. We don't have much in fact, this is about the only reference I know in the New Testament. There's some external references, by that I mean not inspired references, that talk about, Plummer quotes from one source, it talks about he's a man of middling size, but that his legs were crooked, in other words, bow-legged, and that he had large eyes and eyebrows didn't meet, or his eyebrows did meet, and that his nose was somewhat long, whether that's true or not, but the description is that he was not the kind of guy that you would be impressed with if you saw him. If you walked through the building today and we said, he's going to preach, you'd say, him? I don't know if I can listen to that. His speech contemptible. Apparently he didn't have fluent flow of tongue as a Bible character. Who would you cite as a man who could flow with the speech? Apollos was very fluent as a speaker. He would dazzle us and impress us. Apparently not Paul. And so his point here is that this is what's being said about me, but he says, I will be bold in my presence as well. What does he mean by that? When I come to you, absolutely. We'll see that again in chapter 12. That I'm going to come to you, and if I need to be bold and I need to rebuke and I need to say some harsh things, I will do that when I get there. I'll be as bold in presence as I was in letter. All right, my authority is from God and I'm going to use it. Now let's summarize here, 12 to 18. My authority does not cause me to boast. Now you say, well, that's a contradiction because in chapter 11, he does boast. I think his point here is not boasting as others boast. I wanted to spend just a moment with verse 12 and look at a couple of comparative translations that may help us with that, and we'll get to those here in just a second. His point in verse 12 to 16 is, I'm not boasting of myself. I think what he means by that is, I'm not boasting, I'm not here to tell you how great I am, to tell you all my credentials, to impress you with myself. That's not what I'm after. When Paul defends himself, do you think Paul enjoys 2 Corinthians writing it? No, if he's an humble man, he doesn't enjoy talking about himself as much. I would take it. In fact, he tells us in chapter 12, he really doesn't want to do this, doesn't he? Didn't he say that? Not in that exact phrase, but did you get the impression that he doesn't like talking about all of this? But I will, and I'm forced to. We'll come more to that here in a moment. But let's start with verse 12. I'm not boasting as others do. Now, this is a passage I hear quoted in several different directions and misused at times. I've misused it at times until I studied it more and I think I understand it better. So let's see what it says. We dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves, but they measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves are not wise. Other than being a tongue twister, it's kind of, you read through that and you go, oh, what in the world is that about? I do not think the passage is actually talking about looking to others as examples and then you compare yourself. Am I measuring up to that? And that's been used that way before. Let's look at a couple of translations. I think what he's talking about is using yourself as a standard. One who boasts of themselves obviously use themselves as the standard, and if you are not like me and you don't measure up to me, then you're not what you should be. Make sense? Now listen to the NCV, that's a New Century Version. It's kind of free and eclectic, I recognize, but it serves as a pretty good paraphrase at times. We dare not compare ourselves with those who think they are very important. They use themselves to measure themselves, and they judge themselves by what they themselves are. And they show they know nothing. In other words, they set themselves up as the standard. The NLT is even better on that. Oh, don't worry, we don't dare say that we're as wonderful as other men who tell you how important they are. I like that. But they are only comparing themselves with each other, using themselves as the standard of measure. How ignorant. And that's, again, kind of free and eclectic translation, but it, I think, gets to the gist. I'm not like my critics who set themselves up as a standard and display their ignorance by making themselves the standard. I'm not boasting in that sense. I'm not going to boast above measure. What does he mean by that? Verse 13. Absolutely. Within the confines and within the reason, that's a good phrase. Within the confines of the authority that God has given me, and he'll talk about that in chapter 11. So 13b to 16, his point is, but we use that authority to preach to you and to preach to others. So here's, we said this was a battle for the souls of men. Look at verse 15. Not boasting beyond measure, that is in other men's labors, but having hope that your faith is increased, that we shall greatly enlarge by you in this sphere to preach the gospel beyond the region. What's the point? That I use this authority that I have to bring the gospel to you, and hoping that with bringing it to you, we could launch the gospel to other regions. I'm after the souls of men. This is not a carnal warfare. Make sense? All right. Now let's finish up 17 and 18 quickly, and we're done with chapter 10. His point is what matters is if God approves. I think it's the same point he made in chapter 5 and in verse 19, I think it is. But his point there is that, again, all that matters is if what God thinks. So my critics don't think much of me, I understand. And some of you have been influenced by these critics. I got that too. I'm speaking as if I'm Paul. But all that really matters is when I'm not going to boast as others. All I really care about is what God thinks of me. And trying to do my work as an apostle. Chapter 10 makes sense? Hurried look, I recognize. Let's go to chapter 11. Chapter 11 is a contrast between Paul and his critics. And I don't have this on the screen, but I probably put above that and make that a secondary thought. That this is Paul's boasting. And he said he didn't boast, but now he does. Paul's boasting. His contrast between himself and his critics. Paul's boasting about his apostleship. Now, if you have previous outlines, I've tweaked this one a little bit. Mike and I worked on this, so he deserves at least half or more of the credit on this outline. So Paul justifies himself for giving a defense, verses 1 to 4. He defends his apostleship, and then Paul's defense by way of comparison. And you're going to see those 3 points as we go along. So let's see what we can do with chapter 11, see if we can get a good summary. Let's talk about verses 1 through 4. Paul justifies himself for giving a defense. Now, let's define boasting here. The sense in which he does boast, and he says later in the context of boast, is what? It's not bragging on himself saying, look how great I am. He just said, I won't do that. chapter 10. What does it mean? All right, boast in the Lord. All right, he boasts in the Lord, but then he goes on to talk about some personal things. So that's partly it, but there's more. He's commending himself, and in so doing, he is, you're exactly right, defending himself. Bingo, that's what I'm after. So maybe this is a poor illustration, but it maybe gets to the point. And I've given this before in 2 Corinthians. Suppose someone doesn't like what the elders here, I and the elders here stand for on, say, divorce and remarriage. And so they make personal attacks, trying to discredit me and not being an able teacher. He can't string a sentence together, da-da-da-da-da. And so I feel like I'm compelled to defend. I can teach. I may not be the best teacher. I may not be the most polished teacher, but I can impart knowledge. Do you think I like talking about myself? No. No, that ain't fun. And so I'm boasting only in the sense that I'm giving a defense. And the ultimate goal is I'm trying to defend the message that I'm preaching, which is coming from God. You're exactly right. All right. So his point is, I'm jealous over you. He compares it to what? I'm jealous over you like, yeah, husband for a wife. In other words, he had taken them and betrothed them to Christ. I had something to do with your marriage to Christ. I led you to Christ. And I'm jealous over you. In other words, here again, I think his point is the same as he did in chapter 10, 1 to 6. We're battling for the hearts and the souls of men. Does that make sense? I'm jealous over you. I'm not jealous that these teachers are getting attention and I'm not. He doesn't care about that. He cares about the souls of men. Now, let's get 3 and 4. His big fear is what? These false teachers who are criticizing Paul, and I'm concerned that you would be led away from the simplicity, the sincerity that is in Christ. In other words, it's not, I've heard this quoted many times, and self-included, this, the gospel is simple. It's just simple ABCs. That's not really what he's talking about. He's talking about the sincerity in Christ, your sincere service in Christ. And check the NCV. I won't take the time to do that. It gives us some little clarity there. That's a New Century Version. Footnote. Let's footnote at verse 3. Some of our own brethren in the creation controversy began to tell us of the 2000, 2001, 2003, etc. They begin to tell us that Genesis 1 and 2 are not literal, and that much of Genesis is not literal. And so they even some of them went so far as to say the serpent in Genesis 3 was not real. That was just a fairy tale. And yet this passage mentions the serpent as if it's real. The serpent deceived Eve. If that wasn't real, then there's no point in bringing it up here at verse 4. Now to start at verse 5, we could say more, but that gets to the point that Paul is justifying his, the reason I'm defending myself is I'm concerned about you. Does that make sense? And I'm afraid these teachers are going to lead you astray. Now start at verse 5 through verse 15. He defends his apostleship. Now, we don't have time, and I apologize for that, to talk about who the eminent apostles are. And I'm going to give you what I think is true, but if you disagree, then have at it. That's fine. We just don't have time to talk about the pros and cons. But I consider that I'm not at all inferior to the most eminent apostles. Some think he's talking about, I'm not inferior to to Peter, and to James, and to John. And so these eminent apostles, okay, I don't think that's the case. But if that's the case, he's saying, I'm just as, I have the same qualities, I have the same qualification, I am just as much an apostle as any apostle, and his point comes out the same. I think it's sarcasm, and there is sarcasm scattered through chapter 11 in the book for itself. He talks about apostles over here at verse 13 who are false apostles. And evidence that that's what he's talking about is he doesn't go on and compare himself to Peter and James and John. He compares himself to the false teachers. beginning later about verse 16. Now, that's the evidence that I cite, and I know there's evidence otherwise, and have at that. But let's go further. Verse 6. That even though I'm untrained in speech, he admitted I'm not the best speaker, but not in knowledge, for we have been thoroughly made manifest among you in all things. So whatever claims, and so whichever way you go, you take Peter and the other apostles, I'm not behind them in any sense. I'm just as much an apostle as the rest of them. If he's talking about these false teachers, and you think them to be apostles or they think them, I'm not behind them one bit. I'm as much an apostle as anyone else. So what's the point of verse 6? We have been thoroughly made manifest among you in all things. You've seen the evidence of my apostleship. He's going to mention in 12 and verse 12 that they had seen the blank of the apostles. What was it? I've demonstrated before you the signs of the apostles. They had seen signs, so they knew he was an apostle. I'm not one bit less of an apostle than anyone else. Make sense? All right. Let's go to 7 to 9. Stephen mentioned this a moment ago. One of their arguments was, you're not a true apostle because you didn't take money. You didn't take support. So let's see what he says. Did I commit sin in abasing myself because I preached the gospel to you free of charge? Well, he did get paid. How did he get paid? Verse 8. He took money from other churches to do them service. Why did he not take pay? Verse 9. He was trying not to burden them. His sole interest again, he's not preaching for the money, is he? He's after the souls of men. Does that make sense? All right. I know that's a hurried look, but let's go to 10 to 15. Why is he boasting 10 to 15? Why is he getting his self-defense? Is it because I don't love you? No, but what? He's concerned about them. Look at verse 12. But what I do, I will also continue to do, that I may cut off the opportunity of those who desire any opportunity. What's he trying to do? Somebody paraphrase that in everyday terms. Trying to refute the false teaching. I'm trying to knock the legs out from under them. I'm trying to disable them. Does that make sense? Now, the reason for that is, he said, they're false apostles, they're deceitful worker. And so, here's a footnote I want us to learn, because quite often, let's forget the text, let's footnote over here. Quite often, when you identify somebody as being, they teach error on X, Y, Z. He's a brother in the Lord, and he preaches over here at XYZ Church, and he teaches error. And you go visit there, and you hear him preach a sermon, you hear him Sunday morning, Sunday night. Quite often the reaction when people come back and report to me, what do they tell me? I heard him preach. He preached the truth. It was a good sermon. And they act surprised. You said he was a false teacher, but he taught the truth. He said, did a lesson on baptism. Man, it was great. Did one on Christian living Sunday night. Man, it was great. False teachers, finish my sentence, do not always preach false doctrine all the time, do they? All right. Here's the danger of false teachers. Verse 13. They transform themselves into apostles of Christ. These are false. They're claiming to be apostles, but they're false apostles. But they make it appear they're apostles of Christ. Well, no wonder. Because Satan himself transformed himself into angel of light. So what's the danger that I'm learning? What's the practical danger I'm learning in 13, 14, 15? Bingo. Keep your eyes open. False teachers don't always look like false teachers. We can easily be deceived. No false teacher comes along and says, I'm about to teach you false doctrine, so y'all be aware, and I want you to understand this false doctrine. He makes it sound like the truth. He can twist and pervert and wrest. He can be transformed. I've had the opportunity to sit at the feet of many false teachers in debate. And I want to tell you, some of them are absolutely skilled beyond measure, that they will shake you to the core. Because you listen to their false teaching and you're wondering, how in the world is a man defending truth going to get up and answer that? Because, I mean, he slithered through those passages, and man, I'm not sure what I'd say about that. And don't ever underestimate the power of false teacher. Don't ever underestimate their power. All right. Now, so he defends his apostleship, and denying this support doesn't mean I'm not an apostle. So let's finish the chapter now. We've got a few minutes, and I know this is hurried, but we're doing double duty today, so we're going to get through, and we'll slow up a little next week. Paul's defense by way of comparison. Now, he mentions his privilege to boast. Let's get 16 to 21. That is, in my mind, a little difficult. More difficult than 22 to 33. We're not going to spend as much time with 22 to 33 for two reasons. One is we're spending more time with the previous verse, and the second is we're running out of time. So here's his point. I say again, let no one think me a fool. I think Paul mentions that he's engaging in foolishness. He did earlier in verses 1 and 2. In other words, I'm having to deal with things I shouldn't have to deal with. I'm having to get on a level I shouldn't have to deal with. Again, someone says, you know what, you were dishonest, you da-da-da-da-da, and they make all kind of false charges against me, and I feel like I've got to defend myself. I've got to engage in this because this is where it put us. That's what he's saying. Now, so I may boast a little. And seeing that many boast according to the flesh, at verse 18, I will also boast. Now, for you put up with fools gladly, since you yourselves are wise. Again, here's sarcasm. He's being sarcastic. It's kind of like you tell a kid when they did something real dumb, well, that was real smart. You know, boy, you know, Einstein, you really did a great job on that. Well, you think you're so wise. Y'all have put up with fools. And so I'm going to summarize 20 and 21 because I want to get to the rest of that as our time is coming close. His point is, I'm going to boast, and one reason I have to is because y'all have tolerated these teachers more than you should have. Does that make sense? And he mentioned in chapter 10, we talked about last time, and I didn't go back over that, at verse 6, he's waiting for their obedience, for you to deal with these teachers yourselves, these false teachers, but you've tolerated them. Now, if you can tolerate them, then maybe you can tolerate me boasting a little bit. Now, what's interesting is he doesn't boast of his great credentials. What does he boast about? Yeah, his sufferings right here. That if I could glory, I would glory in suffering. So let's go through that. He said they claim to be Hebrews. I'm going to paraphrase as we go along. Well, I'm a Hebrew too, verse 22. They're Israelites. Well, so am I. They're Abraham. So am I. See, I got credentials just like they do. He said, I could talk about all my credentials, but let me tell you something that I could boast in, and that is in the suffering. And so this could be a whole study. We could spend a whole hour or longer going through each one of these sufferings that I have been in stripes and in prison and in deaths often, how he was beaten 40 times. He was beaten with a rod. He was shipwrecked 3 times. He was in perils of robbers and perils of countrymen and perils of Gentiles, perils of false brethren. He's been in hunger and thirsting and cold and nakedness. So in other words, look at what I've endured. So let me pause just a minute. I want to get another thought in here. But what's his point in talking about all of his suffering? Perhaps twofold. Yes, sir. Yes, I think that's his point. That the false teachers apparently were not boasting of, look at all they endured for the cause of the Lord. But Paul is not saying, look at me. But what he's saying is, I went through these for you. It's a battle for the souls of men. Now, let's notice verse 28. Besides all of that was his deep concern for all the churches. What does that refer to? I don't think he was overseer of all the churches, as some have argued. Thessalonica, case in point. He was very concerned as he left them in a cloud of persecution. Now, and besides all that, and so I'm thinking that perhaps being shipwrecked didn't bother him near as much as his concern about whether this church over here is going to survive. So let's add verse 29. He said, who is weak? Well, am I not weak? Whoever stumbles to burn into indignation. I think he's saying that when someone was weak, like 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, Romans 14, then I became all things to all men. I was weak with them. In other words, if one was weak in their conscience, I tried to accommodate them. If one stumbled, I burned with indignation. I didn't want anybody to stumble. Goes on talking about all of his sufferings. And what am I looking for? Verse 31, the God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, who's blessed forever, knows that I'm not lying. In other words, all that I suffered through, if I could boast it all, it would be concerning all of my glory. So, of my suffering, that is. So let's go back and get a summary now of 11. He's boasting about his apostleship. Again, boasting in the sense of self-defense. That's what I'm trying to do. Trying to defend. And so Paul justifies himself in giving the defense because of my concern for you. And then secondly, he defends his apostleship. I'm not a least of any apostle. Whether he's talking about Peter and any other apostle or he's talking about the false apostles, I'm not behind any of them. I've got every credential of an apostle. And so if you want to make comparisons, I could go toe-to-toe with them on credentials. But I'm more interested in talking about what I endured. Does that make sense? Questions or comments? Good point. Good point. And we'll end on that. That should encourage us to stand strong just as he did. Good point. Chapter 12, a little slower pace, hopefully next time.